The old painting sat tucked away in a dusty corner of the auction house, just another forgotten piece of history waiting for a new home. It wasn't particularly striking at first glance. A portrait, probably from the late 1800s, showing a woman with a serious expression. Her dress was dark, typical of the Victorian era, and the background was a uniform, almost oppressive shade of brown. Most people walked right past it, drawn instead to the brighter landscapes or more famous names on display. But for Elias Thorne, a private collector with a soft spot for the overlooked, it held a quiet appeal. Elias wasn't after masterpieces or investment pieces. He bought art because it spoke to him, often from places nobody else bothered to look. This portrait, with its solemn subject and its deep, dark background, had a subtle melancholic aura that pulled him in. There was something in the woman's eyes, a hint of a story untold, that resonated with his own quiet nature. He bid on it almost on a whim, surprising himself when the hammer fell and the painting was his for a modest sum. Bringing it home, Elias placed the portrait in his study, a room already filled with similar finds. He liked to live with his art for a while, letting its presence sink in. For the first few days, it was just another antique, a silent observer in his collection. He'd often sit in his armchair, a book in hand, and cast a glance at the woman in the frame. Her gaze seemed to follow him, a common trick of portraiture, but it was part of her charm. It was during one of these quiet evenings, the room lit only by the soft glow of a reading lamp, that Elias noticed it. He had been looking at the painting, letting his eyes drift over the details of her dress, the faint lines around her mouth, and then the background. It was supposed to be a plain, dark brown, almost black in places. But just behind the woman's left shoulder, nestled deep in the shadows, there was a faint mark. He squinted, leaning forward slightly. It was barely there, a smudge perhaps, but it wasn't quite a smudge. It looked deliberate, a tiny scratch perhaps, or a faint symbol that had almost been painted over. Elias got up, walked closer to the canvas. The light from the lamp caught it, making it momentarily clearer. Then it vanished again, as he shifted his position. He ran a finger lightly over the spot, feeling the smooth, aged surface of the oil paint. There was no raised texture, no sign of physical damage. It was as if the mark was under the paint, or perhaps just a trick of the light playing on an uneven surface. He dismissed it, telling himself it was nothing, just his imagination working overtime on an old piece. The painting was old after all. Wear and tear were expected, but the mark, once seen, couldn't be unseen. Over the next few days, it seemed to grow more defined, almost beckoning him. Every time Elias entered the study, his eyes were drawn to that specific spot behind the woman's shoulder. What he had initially thought was just a faint scrape now looked like a tiny, almost erased letter, or part of one. Or maybe it was a symbol, something he couldn't quite place. It was like looking at a word written in fading ink, trying to make out the shapes. He found himself spending more time in the study, not reading, but simply staring at the portrait. He'd move around the room, testing different angles, different light sources, trying to catch the mark clearly. Sometimes it looked like a faint curving line, like the start of an S or a C. Other times it resembled a small, almost triangular shape. The more he looked, the more certain he became that it wasn't just a random imperfection. It felt intentional, hidden. A creeping sense of unease began to settle over him. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like a pervasive feeling of being watched, not just by the woman in the portrait, but by something else, something lurking within the canvas itself. He'd be engrossed in a book, and a sudden shiver would run down his spine. He'd glance up, and for a split second, the woman's expression seemed to have shifted, her solemn gaze now holding a hint of something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or even a silent plea. He started noticing subtle shifts in the atmosphere of the room. The air around the painting felt colder than the rest of the study, a distinct chill that seemed to emanate from the canvas. Sometimes, when he was alone in the house, he thought he heard a faint whisper, a rustling sound that seemed to come from the direction of the study. He'd check, of course, find nothing, and attribute it to the old house settling, or an open window letting in a draft. But the feeling persisted, a quiet hum of something not quite right. Elias, a man of logic and reason, tried to shake off these feelings. It was just an old painting, he told himself. His mind was playing tricks on him, influenced by the melancholic aura he had initially found so appealing. But the mark was undeniably there, an insistent whisper from the canvas, and the subtle changes in the room were becoming harder to ignore. He couldn't just dismiss it anymore. The portrait, once a quiet acquisition, was slowly but surely demanding his full attention, pulling him into its silent, unsettling mystery. He knew deep down that he had to look closer, much closer. Elias finally admitted to himself that he needed a second opinion. He couldn't shake the feeling that the painting was communicating in some way, and his own observations, while intriguing, were too subjective. He decided to consult an art restorer he knew, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Reed, known for her meticulous work and sharp eye for historical detail. He called her, describing the painting and the faint mark in the background, trying to sound as casual as possible, as if it were just a minor curiosity. Evelyn, initially, was polite but skeptical. She had seen countless old paintings with blemishes, cracks, and amateur repairs. She suggested it was likely a scratch, a previous owner's attempt at cleaning, or perhaps some pigment degradation. She agreed to take a look, more out of professional courtesy to Elias than any real expectation of finding something significant. When she arrived at his home a few days later, she brought her usual kit: magnifying glasses, a small portable light, and a patient demeanor. She examined the portrait carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. She ran her fingers lightly over the canvas, feeling for any inconsistencies. Her initial assessment mirrored her phone conversation. "It looks like normal wear and tear, Elias," she said, her voice calm. "Perhaps a bit of overpainting from a clumsy restoration in the past that's faded differently." She even pointed out a faint crackle pattern in the paint that suggested an earlier repair. Elias felt a pang of disappointment, but he pushed her to look specifically at the mark. "Just here, Evelyn," he insisted, pointing to the spot behind the woman's right shoulder. "It's very faint, but it seems deliberate," she humored him, pulling out a small, powerful magnifying glass. She leaned in close, her eyes scanning the dark background. For a long minute there was silence, broken only by the soft hum of the house. Then she straightened up slightly, a flicker of something new in her expression. She murmured. "It's certainly not a common type of damage. It has a peculiar linearity to it." Evelyn then proposed bringing in some of her more advanced equipment. She explained that sometimes layers of paint could hide older images or texts, especially if the original artist had reused a canvas or if something had been intentionally obscured. Elias readily agreed, feeling a renewed sense of hope. He knew he wasn't imagining things. A few days later, Evelyn returned with a small team and specialized equipment: UV lights, infrared cameras, and even a portable X-ray device. The study was transformed into a temporary art laboratory. They carefully positioned the painting, and the lights began to glow. Under the UV light, the painting's surface reacted in strange ways. Areas that looked uniform to the naked eye now showed patches of different luminosity, indicating older layers of varnish or repairs. But it was the infrared camera that truly started to reveal something. On the screen, connected to the camera, faint lines began to emerge beneath the dark background. They weren't just random marks. They had structure, a definite pattern. Elias watched, mesmerized, as more and more details appeared. It was undeniably script, archaic in its lettering, but undeniably text. Evelyn, usually reserved, let out a small gasp. "Good heavens, Elias," she whispered. "You are right. There's something written here." The text was fragmented, parts of it still too faint or too obscured by thick layers of paint to decipher clearly. But certain letters, certain clusters of words, started to take shape. It was a painstaking process, meticulously capturing images, enhancing contrast, and then trying to piece together the fragments like a puzzle. The language appeared to be English, but with older spellings and phrasing. As they worked, a new feeling began to settle in the study. The scientific tools were revealing something deeply personal, something hidden for decades, perhaps more than a century. Evelyn's initial skepticism had completely vanished, replaced by an intense professional intrigue. "This is highly unusual," she kept repeating, almost to herself. "Artists sometimes sketch on the canvas first, but to write text like this, and then paint over it so completely." The first coherent words they managed to reconstruct sent a chill down Elias's spine. They were isolated, disconnected from a larger context, but their meaning was clear. "Trapped within, no escape," another fragment read, "cursed to see forever." As more words were slowly unveiled, the atmosphere in the room grew heavy. The initial excitement of discovery gave way to a growing sense of dread. The words were not a simple signature or a dedication. They were desperate, filled with a profound sorrow and a chilling sense of hopelessness. Evelyn, usually so clinical, found herself pausing, rubbing her arms as if cold, even though the room was warm. They looked at the portrait's subject, the solemn woman, with new eyes. Her gaze, once merely melancholic, now seemed to hold a deeper, more profound suffering. Her expression, framed by the dark background that now held such terrible secrets, appeared almost tormented. It was as if the hidden words were seeping through the paint, changing the very essence of her depiction. Elias felt a profound unease, a sense that he had stumbled upon something he was not meant to see, a private anguish frozen in time, and now, against all odds, trying to speak. The painting was no longer just a beautiful old object. It was a silent witness, a container for a terrible secret, and it was slowly, deliberately, beginning to tell its story. The discovery of the hidden text changed everything. It transformed the portrait from a quaint antique into a mystery, a puzzle begging to be solved. Elias and Evelyn knew they had to find out who painted it and who the woman in the portrait was. The words trapped and cursed echoed in their minds, making the task feel urgent, almost sacred. Their first step was to research the portrait's likely artist. They started with art records from the late 1800s, focusing on artists known for portraiture in the region where Elias had acquired the painting. It was a long shot. Many artists from that period were obscure, their works poorly documented. They spent days sifting through old exhibition catalogues, auction records, and art history texts, often feeling like they were looking for a needle in a haystack. The painting itself offered few clues. No visible signature, no date. Its style was typical of the era, making it hard to pinpoint a specific hand without more information. The initial search was frustrating, filled with dead ends. They found many artists, but none whose style perfectly matched or who seemed to fit the emerging dark narrative of the portrait. Elias started to feel discouraged, wondering if the artist was simply too minor to be recorded, or if the painting had been deliberately obscured. He imagined an artist who wanted their work to be forgotten, perhaps even feared. Then Evelyn found a small, almost forgotten mention in an old art journal. It spoke of a reclusive painter named Alistair Finch, known for his striking, if somewhat unsettling, portraits. The article from 1892 described Finch as an artist of uncommon talent but peculiar temperament, someone who often chose somber subjects and whose studio was rumored to be a place of deep shadows and hushed secrets. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. They dug deeper into Alistair Finch's life. What they found painted a picture of a man who started with promise but slowly descended into isolation and eccentricity. Early accounts praised his skill, his ability to capture the essence of his subjects. But as the years went on, the tone shifted. Mentions of him became rarer, often accompanied by whispers of strange habits and a growing obsession with darker themes. He reportedly lived in a remote house, rarely venturing out, and his later works were said to be disturbing, imbued with a sense of unease that clients found off-putting. Some even hinted at a fascination with the occult, though these were dismissed as gossip. Stories circulated about Finch's studio. Visitors spoke of an oppressive atmosphere, a feeling of being watched even when alone. Models often refused to sit for him a second time, complaining of vivid, disturbing dreams after their sessions. There were rumors that Finch believed he could capture more than just an image on canvas. He believed he could capture a piece of the soul. These were, of course, just rumors, the kind of exaggerated tales that cling to reclusive artists. But given the hidden text in the portrait, they now took on a chilling new significance. Elias and Evelyn started to connect the dots. The timeline fit. The artistic style, while common for the period, had a certain intensity that, once they knew about Finch, seemed to align with his described approach. The reclusiveness, the dark themes, the rumored eccentricities, it all began to point towards Alistair Finch as their artist. The most disturbing reports concerned Finch's final, unfinished works. After his death, his studio was found in disarray. Many canvases were slashed, others left incomplete, but a few were described as having unsettling hidden elements. One account mentioned a portrait where the background, upon close inspection, seemed to writhe with indistinct shapes, almost like faces or figures trapped within the paint. This detail sent a shiver down Elias's spine. It sounded eerily similar to what they were discovering in his own portrait. The more they learned about Finch, the more the hidden text in the portrait made sense. The artist's rumored beliefs, his descent into what some called madness, his fascination with the unseen and the unsettling. It all began to align with the desperate message of the portrait. The words trapped and cursed no longer felt like random pleas, but like an intentional part of the artist's dark vision. As they pieced together Finch's story, the painting's background started to look different to Elias. It wasn't just a dark, neutral space behind the woman. With the knowledge of Finch's rumored obsessions, the deep shadows and murky tones now seemed to represent something more symbolic. It felt less like a simple setting and more like a representation of confinement, or even despair. The way the light faded into the darkness, the subtle variations in hue, suddenly suggested depth and oppression. It was as if the artist had deliberately crafted a prison for his subject, not just on the canvas but within the very essence of the painting. The portrait was no longer just an artwork. It was a testament to one man's dark obsession and another's silent suffering. The more they uncovered about the artist, the more the painting seemed to reveal its true chilling purpose. Now that they had a clearer picture of the artist, Alistair Finch, the next logical step was to identify the woman in the portrait. Elias and Evelyn knew that understanding her story was key to fully deciphering the message hidden in the background. They started by looking for any records that might link Finch to his subjects. This proved difficult. Finch was a recluse, and his clients were often obscure figures themselves, or their names had simply been lost to time. They sifted through old census records, local historical society archives, and even newspaper clippings from the late 1800s, hoping for a mention of a woman who might fit the portrait's description and have some connection to the eccentric artist. Initial searches turned up dead ends. The woman appeared to be an ordinary individual, someone who didn't warrant much attention in historical documents. There were no grand titles, no famous deeds, just the quiet face looking out from the canvas. This made their task even harder. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack that was over a century old. Days bled into weeks, filled with dusty books and microfilm readers, until Evelyn stumbled upon a minor historical footnote in a local gazette from 1888. It was a short article about a series of unexplained disappearances in the rural area where Finch had lived. Most were dismissed as people leaving to seek work elsewhere, but one case stood out. A young woman, a seamstress named Elara Vance, had vanished without a trace. Her family, new to the area, had reported it, but the local authorities had quickly given up the search. The description of Elara, though brief, mentioned her striking dark hair and solemn eyes, a detail that resonated strongly with the portrait. The Gazette also mentioned that Elara had briefly worked for a reclusive painter known for his unusual commissions. The article didn't name Finch directly, but the description fit perfectly. This was the breakthrough they needed. Elias felt a jolt of recognition, a cold certainty that they had found their subject. The fact that she had simply disappeared, her case unsolved, added another layer of grim mystery to the painting. As they dug deeper into Elara Vance's story, a tragic life began to unfold. She was an orphan, a quiet girl who had moved from a distant village to work and support herself. Her life was marked by hardship and isolation. The Gazette mentioned that she had been betrayed by a close acquaintance, losing her meager savings shortly before she vanished. The hidden text in the portrait, which had been slowly revealing itself, now seemed to explicitly refer to Elara's suffering. Words like abandoned, deceived, and lost started to appear more clearly, interwoven with the earlier pleas of trapped and cursed. It was as if the painting itself was providing a narrative, a silent account of her misfortunes. Elias felt a profound empathy for Elara. She wasn't just a subject in a painting anymore. She was a real person whose life had ended in tragedy and mystery. He started to see her not as a static image, but as a trapped soul, her eyes holding a silent, desperate plea. The portrait had become a window into a past injustice, a testament to a life cut short and forgotten. This shift in perspective made the painting feel less like an antique and more like a living, breathing entity carrying the weight of a century-old sorrow. It was around this time that the unexplained phenomena began. At first, they were subtle. Elias would notice the lights in his study flicker for a moment, even when no other appliances were on. He'd feel a sudden, inexplicable chill in the room where the portrait hung, even on warm days. Sometimes he thought he heard faint whispers, like distant voices carried on the wind, but they would always vanish when he tried to focus on them. He tried to rationalize these occurrences, blaming old wiring or the house settling, but deep down he knew they were connected to the painting. The dreams started shortly after, vivid, disturbing dreams that felt too real to be mere figments of his imagination. He would see Elara, not as the serene figure in the portrait, but in distress, her face contorted in fear or anguish. She would be trapped in dark, confined spaces, trying to reach out, to speak, but no sound would come. He would wake up in a cold sweat. The images burned into his mind, the feeling of her despair lingering in the air. These dreams were relentless, eroding his sleep and his peace of mind. One evening, Elias was sitting in his study, staring at the portrait, feeling the weight of Elara's story. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the old house. He noticed something unusual. The faint text in the background, which they had been slowly deciphering with their specialized equipment, seemed to have shifted. New words had appeared, clearer than before, even without the UV light. It was as if the painting was revealing more of its secrets on its own, responding to their understanding of Elara's fate. The words vengeance and unjust now mingled with the others, adding a chilling new dimension to the message. The painting was not just a record of suffering, it was a demand for something more. The curse was not just on Elara, it felt like it was starting to spread. The combined efforts of Elias and Dr. Albright finally pieced together the fragmented text, a process that had become increasingly urgent as the phenomena around the painting intensified. What they uncovered was not just a message, but a desperate confession, a chilling accusation, and a tragic plea. The archaic script, now fully deciphered, told a story far darker than they had imagined. It spoke of a secret affair between Elara and a powerful, unnamed local figure, a man who feared scandal more than he valued a human life. The text detailed how Elara had become pregnant, and how this man, in his desperation to maintain his reputation, had conspired with the artist, a man named Alaric, to silence her. Alaric, it turned out, was not just an eccentric painter. He was a man deeply entrenched in obscure, forbidden practices. The hidden message explicitly described a sinister pact, a dark ritual performed not long after Alara had sat for the portrait. The painting itself was not merely a depiction of Alara, it was meant to be a vessel, a prison for her spirit. The powerful figure had paid Alaric handsomely to ensure Alara's silence, and Alaric, in his twisted artistry, had found a way to bind her essence to the canvas. The text spoke of specific incantations, of a drop of Alara's blood mixed into the paints, and of her final, terrified realization of what was happening as Alaric completed the portrait. It was a horrifying testament to a crime, a ritual designed to trap Alara's very soul within the confines of the oil and canvas, ensuring her secret would die with her, or rather, be eternally silenced within the painting. Elias felt a cold dread settle deep in his bones. The painting wasn't just a representation of Alara, it was her living prison, a testament to her unending torment. The artist hadn't just painted her image, he had painted her fate, her suffering, her very essence. This wasn't merely a historical artifact, it was a living, breathing tomb. Dr. Albright, usually composed, looked visibly shaken. Her academic curiosity had turned into a profound sense of moral outrage and a growing fear. The implications were staggering, reaching beyond art history into the realm of the truly macabre. The man who had commissioned Alara's silence had succeeded, but he hadn't accounted for the painting itself becoming a witness, slowly, painstakingly, revealing the truth over a century later. The phenomena around the portrait escalated dramatically after the full message was deciphered. The flickering lights became more frequent and intense, often plunging the study into complete darkness for several terrifying seconds before returning. The cold spots in the room were no longer localized. They moved, swirling around Elias as he sat near the painting, making the air feel heavy and suffocating. He started seeing shadows in his peripheral vision, fleeting, indistinct shapes that would vanish the moment he turned his head. He tried to tell himself it was his mind playing tricks, a result of sleep deprivation and stress, but the experiences were too consistent, too unsettling. One night, a heavy antique book on a shelf near the portrait suddenly flew across the room, hitting the wall with a loud thud. Elias jumped, his heart pounding. He stood frozen, staring at the painting. Alara's eyes, which he had always found melancholic, now seemed to burn with a desperate, almost accusatory fire. He could almost hear the faint whispers forming into distinct guttural sounds, though he couldn't make out the words. It was no longer just the feeling of a presence. It was a distinct, malevolent energy filling the room. His sanity was tested daily. He would find himself talking to the portrait, pleading with Alara, with the entity, to leave him alone, to find peace. He knew it sounded crazy, but the line between reality and the supernatural had blurred into non-existence. He felt Alara's anguish, her rage, her desperate plea for justice, as if it were his own. The dreams became nightmares of being trapped, of suffocating, of seeing Alaric's cold, calculating face as he completed the final strokes of the cursed painting. Elias started avoiding sleep, fearing the torment that awaited him in his subconscious. He was constantly tired, his nerves frayed, his once orderly life now a chaotic mess dictated by the whims of a century-old curse. The portrait was all he could think about, all he could feel. It had consumed him. He knew he couldn't live like this much longer. He had to do something, anything, to break this cycle of torment. The painting was no longer just an object of study. It was an active threat, and he, Elias, had become its primary target. He was living in a haunted house, and the ghost was trapped in a frame, its suffering echoing through his very soul. Elias knew he couldn't fight this alone. The subtle discomfort had morphed into outright terror, and his rational mind, once his greatest asset, was failing him. The portrait wasn't just a painting anymore. It was a living, breathing nightmare that had latched onto his very soul. He needed help, and not the kind art historians could provide. He needed someone who understood the unseen, the spiritual, the truly terrifying. Hesitantly, he reached out to a small, discreet group of paranormal investigators he'd heard about through a whispered connection at a local historical society. He had always scoffed at such things, but now, faced with Alara's tortured spirit and Alaric's lingering malice, he was desperate. The leader of the group, a woman named Sarah, arrived with her team a few days later. She was quiet, with kind but intensely observant eyes, and carried an air of calm authority that Elias found surprisingly reassuring. Her team consisted of a tech specialist, David, who set up an array of sophisticated equipment, EMF detectors, thermal cameras, audio recorders, and a sensitive, Maria, who sat quietly, her gaze often drifting towards the portrait with a distant, troubled look. Elias explained everything from the initial acquisition of the painting to the deciphered message, the escalating phenomena, and his own unraveling sanity. He expected skepticism, but Sarah just nodded, her expression grim. "We've seen similar cases," she said softly, her voice low. "Objects that act as anchors or even prisons for spirits, especially when there's a strong emotional charge like betrayal or injustice." Even as they set up, the paintings seemed to react. The air in the study grew heavy, and David's EMF detector spiked erratically whenever he got too close to the canvas. Maria, the sensitive, began to shiver, wrapping her arms around herself. "She's here," Maria whispered, her voice strained. "So much pain. And something else, something cold, watching." Elias felt a surge of relief that he wasn't imagining it, quickly followed by a deeper dread. The entity was real, and it was powerful. Sarah confirmed their initial findings. "This isn't just a residual haunting, Elias. There's an intelligent energy here, and it's very distressed. And there's another presence, a darker one, feeding off it." She was referring to Alaric, the artist, whose malevolent intent had started this whole horrifying saga. The trapped spirit, Alara, began to directly influence their environment, almost as if trying to communicate through sheer force of will and fear. During their observations, a cold gust of wind swept through the closed room, rustling papers and making the curtains sway. David's audio recorder picked up faint, distorted whispers that were impossible to make out clearly, but the tone was unmistakable: agony and rage. The hidden text, painstakingly revealed over weeks of careful restoration, now seemed to possess a life of its own. In the dim light of the evening, Elias swore he saw a faint, eerie glow emanating from the archaic script on the background, pulsating with an unseen energy, like a trapped heartbeat. It was a soft, phosphorescent light that seemed to ebb and flow, drawing his eyes to the words that detailed Ilara's suffering and Alaric's crime. Elias himself became a conduit for this escalating energy. He felt Ilara's despair almost constantly, a heavy cloak of sadness that settled over him. His sleep offered no escape. His dreams were vivid, disturbing replays of Ilara's final moments, seen through her eyes, feeling her terror and betrayal. He would wake up in a cold sweat, physically and emotionally drained, as if he had lived through her ordeal himself. The entity was drawing on him, feeding on his fear, on his empathy. His appetite vanished, his once robust health deteriorated, and dark circles formed under his eyes. He felt a constant ache in his chest, a reflection of Ilara's own trapped heart. He was becoming a shadow of his former self, consumed by the painting's tragic narrative. Sarah and her team recognized the signs. "This entity is trying to communicate, but also to exert its influence," Sarah explained to Elias, her voice grave. "It's been trapped for a very long time, and your efforts to uncover its story have stirred it profoundly. The other presence, the darker one, is also reacting. It doesn't want this secret fully exposed." They decided a ritual was necessary. Not an exorcism in the traditional sense, but an attempt to release Ilara's spirit from its painted prison, to allow her to find peace or move on. They believed that by acknowledging her suffering and providing a means for her voice to be heard, they could sever the ties binding her to the canvas and hopefully weaken the malevolent entity of Alaric that had used her as its victim. It was a delicate balance, a dangerous endeavor. They were not just dealing with a ghost, but with a powerful, centuries-old magical binding, a dark spell woven into the very fabric of the painting. The night of the ritual was cold and still. Sarah, Maria, and David prepared the study. They dimmed the lights, lit candles, and placed ancient symbols around the portrait, creating a protective circle. Elias sat opposite the painting, his heart pounding, a mixture of fear and desperate hope swirling within him. Maria began to chant softly in an old language, her voice low and melodic, while Sarah burned herbs that filled the air with a pungent, earthy scent. As the ritual deepened, the painting reacted violently. The colors on the canvas seemed to deepen, then swirl, as if the paint itself was alive and agitated. The background, once a dark, indistinct landscape, began to ripple and shift, the hidden text glowing with an intense, almost blinding light. A low, guttural growl emanated from the canvas, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the wood and pigment, reverberating through the room. It was not Ilara's voice, but something far more ancient and sinister, Alaric's lingering malice, resisting their efforts. The canvas vibrated, shaking on its easel, the old frame groaning under an unseen force. The candles flickered wildly, threatening to extinguish, and the air grew impossibly cold, making Elias's breath fog. The unearthly wail that then burst forth from the portrait was not human. It was a sound of pure agony mixed with furious rage, a deafening scream that tore through the silence of the night. It was Ilara's pain, but amplified, distorted by the malevolent force that had held her captive for so long. The forces at play were far more powerful than any of them had anticipated. The protective circle began to crack, the symbols on the floor dimming as if drained of energy. David's equipment went haywire, lights flashing, static crackling through the speakers. Maria cried out, clutching her head, overwhelmed by the torrent of emotions and raw power. Sarah, her face pale but determined, continued her incantations, her voice strained against the cacophony. The confrontation had begun, and it was terrifying. The painting was fighting back, and it was clear this was not just a simple ghost they were dealing with, but a powerful, ancient evil, intent on keeping its secrets buried. Elias watched, paralyzed, as the portrait twisted and writhed, its painted subject's eyes now wide with a mixture of terror and fierce defiance, locked in an eternal struggle against the darkness that sought to consume her. The violent reaction of the painting had consequences none of them had truly prepared for. The protective circle, meant to contain the ritual's energies, fractured under the strain, and the raw power unleashed by the portrait surged outward. Elias felt a sharp, burning sensation in his chest, as if something cold and heavy had slammed into him. He crumpled to the floor, gasping for air, his vision blurring at the edges. It wasn't a physical blow, but a spiritual one, a shockwave of malevolence that left him disoriented and weak. Maria, who had been chanting, fell silent, her eyes wide and unfocused, a thin trickle of blood running from her nose. She stared vacantly at the swirling canvas, seemingly lost in a nightmare only she could see. David, attempting to shield his equipment, was thrown back against the wall, his head hitting the plaster with a sickening thud. He lay there, still, his breath shallow. Sarah, though shaken, remained on her feet, her hands clasped tightly, her incantations now a desperate plea rather than a chant. The ritual had not released Ilara. It had ripped open a portal, unleashing something far more potent than they had imagined. The painting, which had been vibrating violently, now grew unnervingly still. The unearthly wail died down to a low, humming thrum, a sound that seemed to resonate deep within Elias's bones. The hidden text, once glowing, now pulsed with a dark, oily light, shadows dancing around the archaic symbols. The background of the portrait had completely changed. It was no longer the dark, swirling void they had seen during the ritual. Instead, it was a landscape of twisted, gnarled trees reaching up to a sky the color of dried blood. Figures, indistinct and grotesque, writhed in the shadows beneath the branches. Ilara's face, once a portrait of anguished defiance, was now a mask of pure terror, her eyes wide and fixed on something beyond the canvas, something that had clearly broken free. Elias pushed himself up, his head swimming, and crawled towards Maria. Her eyes were still vacant, but her lips moved silently, forming words he couldn't hear. It was then that Maria spoke, not in her own voice, but in a low, raspy whisper that sent shivers down Elias's spine. "He made me do it," the voice rasped. "He bound me, not to the canvas, but to him. The painting, it was his tool, a conduit for his hunger. He fed on my fear, on my despair." The voice paused, then continued. "The words, not a plea for help, a part of the binding, a spell to keep me trapped, to fuel his power. He wanted me to suffer, forever." The truth hit Elias like a physical blow. The painting was not Ilara's prison, but a conduit, a vessel. Alaric, the artist, had not simply painted a portrait. He had woven a dark spell, using Ilara's life force, her suffering, to fuel his own malevolent power. The hidden text, which they had painstakingly deciphered, was not a desperate message from Ilara, but a part of Alaric's binding spell, a series of incantations designed to keep her spirit tethered, endlessly feeding his dark magic. The ritual, intended to free Ilara, had instead served to sever the last connection between Alaric and his tethered victim, but not in the way they had hoped. It had not freed Ilara to peace, it had simply broken the chain, allowing Alaric's malevolent essence, which had been subtly influencing the painting all along, to fully manifest. The painting was not just a prison, it was a power source, and by trying to dismantle it, they had inadvertently overloaded the circuit, releasing the main generator. A cold dread settled over Elias. The entity was no longer confined to the painting. It had broken free. The air in the room grew heavy, oppressive. Elias could feel its presence, a suffocating darkness that pressed in from all sides. He looked at the painting again. Ilara's face was now contorted in a silent scream, her eyes fixed on him, not in terror, but in a desperate warning. The background of the painting, the twisted trees and shadowy figures, seemed to shimmer shimmer, as if the scene itself was alive, breathing. It was a reflection of the horror that had just been unleashed, a living testament to Alaric's dark power. Sarah, recovering her composure, moved quickly to David, checking his pulse. He was alive, but unconscious. She then turned to Maria, her face etched with concern. Maria was still mumbling, her eyes seeing something far away. "He is here," she whispered, her voice still not her own. "He was always here, waiting. We opened the door." Elias stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his ears. The act of uncovering the secret, of attempting to release Ilara, had not brought peace. It had unleashed something far worse. Alaric, the artist, was not just a historical footnote, a forgotten painter. He was a malevolent force, a centuries-old entity that had used Ilara's suffering to sustain itself, and now he was free. The painting, once a source of fascination, was now a terrifying gateway. Its altered background, a window into the nightmare they had inadvertently brought into their world. The knowledge they had sought, the truth they had so desperately chased, had come at an unthinkable price. They had not saved Ilara. They had merely changed the nature of her torment, and in doing so had invited a greater evil into their lives. The true horror had only just begun. The entity, now fully uncontained, began to terrorize Elias and those who had been connected to the painting. It wasn't a sudden, violent attack, but a creeping dread, a slow unraveling of their lives. Elias found himself plagued by nightmares that felt more real than his waking hours. He would see Alaric not as a figure from history, but as a looming shadow, his eyes burning with an ancient malevolence. The dreams were filled with Ilara's screams, not of pain, but of a chilling, otherworldly despair that echoed in his ears long after he woke. He tried to explain it to Sarah, but his words felt hollow, inadequate. How could he describe a horror that seeped into the very fabric of his being? The painting, which they had carefully placed back in its spot, remained a constant, terrifying reminder. Its background now displayed a perpetual, shifting horror. The twisted trees writhed, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out, and the shadowy figures moved, their forms indistinct yet menacing. Ilara's face, once a portrait of sorrowful beauty, was now contorted in eternal agony, her eyes wide with a silent scream, or sometimes a cold, malevolent gaze that seemed to follow Elias no matter where he stood. It was as if Alaric's spirit had merged with hers, twisting her essence into something monstrous. Elias couldn't bring himself to destroy it, to burn it, to do anything to it. It felt like that would only make things worse, like it would fully unleash whatever was trapped within its canvas. He was a reluctant guardian, bound to the very thing that tormented him. His life became a desolate landscape of fear. He couldn't sleep without the aid of strong sedatives, and even then he would often wake in a cold sweat, convinced he heard whispers in the dark. He saw Alaric's shadow in every corner, felt his cold breath on his neck. The knowledge of the painting's secret became a heavy chain, isolating him from the normal world. Friends stopped calling, unable to understand the haunted look in his eyes, the way he flinched at sudden sounds. He tried to explain, to share the burden, but his words sounded like the ravings of a madman. He knew they thought he was losing his mind, and perhaps he was. The line between sanity and madness was blurring, pushed thin by the constant pressure of Alaric's presence. Sarah, too, was affected. She became withdrawn, her vibrant energy replaced by a quiet weariness. She still worked, but her focus was gone, replaced by a distant look, as if part of her mind was always listening for something else. David, after regaining consciousness, had no memory of the ritual, but he spoke of disturbing dreams and a pervasive sense of dread that he couldn't shake. Maria, however, was the most tragic. She had become completely catatonic, her eyes fixed, unseeing, her body occasionally trembling. The doctors said it was a severe psychological break, but Elias knew it was Alaric still clinging to her, feeding on her mind. He visited her often, whispering apologies, knowing it was his quest for truth that had led them all to this hell. Elias was left haunted, his life irrevocably changed by the encounter. He would walk through his house, now a silent, echoing tomb, and feel Alaric's presence like a physical weight. The world outside seemed dull, muted, compared to the vibrant, terrifying reality he now inhabited. He was a prisoner in his own home, bound by an invisible leash to the painting, to the entity he had helped to unleash. He often wondered if he should have left the mark untouched, if ignorance truly was bliss. But the curiosity, the drive to know, had been too strong, and now he paid the price. The painting remained in his study, covered with a thick black cloth, but its power its malevolence seeped through. Sometimes he would hear a faint scratching from beneath the cloth, or a low, guttural moan. He knew it was Alaric, still there, still watching, still waiting. The final shot of the painting, unveiled, showed its background as a swirling vortex of despair, colors bleeding into each other like raw wounds. Alara's face, a mask of eternal torment, her eyes now burning with Alaric's cold fire. It was a terrifying, ever-changing landscape of suffering, a testament to the horror that had been unleashed. The story of the portrait wasn't just a tale of a cursed painting, it was a chilling warning. Curiosity, Elias now understood, could be a dangerous, even deadly force when it unearthed ancient evils. Some secrets were best left buried, hidden away in the dusty corners of history, undisturbed, because when you opened those doors, you never knew what might step through, and sometimes what stepped through decided to stay, turning your life into its own personal canvas of eternal torment. Elias was the living embodiment of that warning, a man condemned to a life of perpetual fear, forever guarding a gate he had unknowingly opened. The horror was far from over. It had only just begun, and he was its first, and perhaps its last, victim.